So welcome to our webinar, Fortifying Infrastructure and Intelligence First Approach to Industrial Threats. Thank you for joining us. Again, I'm Danielle Gauthier, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Cyber Threat Intelligence at Dragos. Today, we'll be discussing the unique nature of OT threats and OT threat intelligence, along with best practices for using intel when securing industrial infrastructures. Before we get started, this session is being recorded and the recording will be emailed to you after the session. Also, your microphones have been muted, but we still want to interact with you. So please use the Q&A chat feature to submit any questions you have, and we'll try to get to your questions as we go. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's session. We're joined by Scott Dowsett, Global Field CTO at Anomaly, and Magpie Graham, Technical Director of Intelligence at Dragos. We have a great session planned for you today. We'll start out with introductions, then we'll go into a discussion of using cyber threat intelligence, a deep dive into understanding OT threats, and then we'll go into how to go about analyzing your OT threats, followed by a period where you'll be able to ask questions at the end. And now I will pass it off to our speakers.
Thanks, Danielle. I'm Magpie, as Danielle said, Technical Director in the Intel team at Dragos. So I very much about data, tooling, making those efficiencies and helping our intelligence analysts get to the right answers in the quickest way possible to get the intelligence in the hands of our great customers.
Hey everyone, Scott Dowsett, Global Field CTO for Anomaly. Looking forward to the conversation today. Anomaly actually provides a security operation platform powered by AI. So looking forward to show you how we do it. Thank you.
So cyber threat intelligence comes in many forms from many providers. And I think there tends to be a misconception both amongst the consumers, but also some of those providers, that a stream of indicators of compromise, which in essence is data, constitutes intelligence. And it really doesn't. Obviously, indicators are very helpful in terms of detections within an environment, be that within the network or on the host side. However, they lack the context that you need to expect and need to demand from providers that allow you to make the right decisions should a detection occur in your environment. Now, sometimes that might be that it's a true positive, sometimes it could be a false positive, but usually without some additional information, you've got no way to know. You don't know how to respond, and you don't know how this fits in with the larger decisions of your business, your organization, or any impact that might have on your sector or just in the larger geopolitical sphere. So indicators of compromise, certainly not intelligence. However, when you start to bring in TTPs and the motivations of an actor, potential attribution, the larger corpuses of information that allow you to take that detection and maybe walk backwards, walk forwards through the kill chain, find out where the actor may have come from, how did they gain access to the network, where could they go next, and what would that look like? What tradecraft do they routinely use when compromising targets? And typically targets probably like your own organization, because threat actors have many missions and do behave in different ways depending on what their current goal is, but also the type of target that they're engaged with. Threat intelligence isn't necessarily useful to everyone when it comes to those details of attacks. I think being aware of threats and being aware of the trends, certainly when it comes to things like new tool sets that are widely available or vulnerabilities that have exploits for them, that's very much interesting information. It's useful information to maybe get a feel on the status quo, what is happening in the world right now. But an actor that goes after humanitarian aid exclusively in the Far East is unlikely to target an oil and gas customer within North America. So often a number of feeds are not tailored, but rather they are attempting to solve all the problems, cover all possible reporting. And this is where perhaps less than 10% of that reporting could be relevant to your organization. It's not necessarily poor quality information. It could be great, but it doesn't help you in your day-to-day job to either defend your enterprise or to inform the business about risk and to make some of those decisions. Those decisions might be which vendor you go with in terms of technology choices. What do you host in the cloud versus on-prem? Where do you actually run business in the world? Is there potential areas where new threats would open up to you because they're already targeting that type of industry sector in that region? When it comes to IT and OT, there are a number of providers. In fact, I think pretty much every provider is exclusively IT, whereas Dragos is, solely industrial focused OT threat intelligence. And although we track some of the same actors that many other companies do, we don't track those events that are unrelated to that kind of industrial targeting. So we can focus purely on what happens in the pre-positioning, in the attack phase, and what might happen within an OT environment for those actors that we track. Being able to be well informed about those the TTPs, the modus operandi of these adversaries, and hopefully not responding to just a detection event in your environment, but understanding how that maps to the defensive measures you can take allows you to take preemptive action, mitigate some of these threats. It's not just patching, it's looking at your architecture, it's thinking about how you control access to your environments, segregation. Do you maybe even have a red team or run some penetration tests where you mimic those actors that are most likely to target your organization or sector? In that case, that's a really good way to test out the defensive blue team. You can plant things in your environment like reused creds. And essentially, I think that although that sometimes works out well to kind of follow that path through and emulate an actor, chances are a really good red team's going to find those weaknesses anyway. And you can then begin to take those steps to remove those items of low-hanging fruit that most of the cyber actors these days are very, very well versed in discovering and making the best use of. Just a little bit on where we actually source our intelligence. So we obviously cover the actors themselves, their tools and their tradecraft and infrastructure. We produce that based on a combination of our incident response customers, but a lot of proactive research using first-party and third-party data sources as well.
Awesome. And just to add on to that, so Anomaly draws information from Dragos and many other providers in the platform. So to include ISACs, government advisories, open source, peer-to-peer sharing networks, as well as you can see joint cybersecurity operations and partner agreements. So bringing data in from multiple sources is what the Anomaly platform does. Along with that, we also have the ability to bring it in from the local environment, so local telemetry. So think of your network, your endpoints, your data sources, incident management, basically any information that's internal. And as Magpie mentioned also, so either looking at the cloud or on-premise in the environment. So finding what matters to you. So unlocking visibility to drive your action. All right, optimizing value from security controls, and then making things more efficient. So the goal of this is to drive the teams and make them more efficient in the environment. So action visibility, optimize cyber stack, and even automating SecOps. So driving these from the data that you have. So knowing your telemetry, knowing the intelligence, and then driving the two together to make discerned decisions. I'll pass it back to Magpie to dive a little deeper.
So one of the things that I guess is the main differentiator in terms of where we might source data that is able to be analyzed and then produces threat intelligence when we make assessments on that between the OT environment and the IT environment would be the fact that we're looking at a different set of network protocols here. We're looking at often very specific communications between devices that aren't your standard sort of TCP or UDP that you might expect to see running within a normal environment on the enterprise IT side. So one of the main stages really, I guess, into how you can begin to understand how an adversary operates within that environment is to be able to decode those learn how they work, understand where it's anomalous, and then basically understand where it may be abused. Now, that might be using the tools that are provided by a vendor, but in a different way to the day-to-day running of an OT facility, or it could be that they've written their own tooling and that behaves in a very different way too. In which case, it's often that we can signature that for the specific tool. And a lot of these tools would be unique to that actor, given that this is not something that you can just go and get something off the shelf or download Cobalt Strike and use an OT capable plugin to achieve the same effect. Now, vulnerabilities, obviously there is overlap here, not just between that perimeter, but also a lot of the kind of edge devices these days. I guess everyone was working from home during the pandemic, and that was no different for engineers who needed to access OT environments. And so a number of OT environments have been connected to the internet. Ideally, we have firewalls, we have VPNs, and even if they're under a different name, rebranded for the OT space, perhaps hardened in some way physically, they are likely to be the same types of equipment that you would find in an enterprise. So when we hear about the latest 0 days affecting those devices, that could actually be a source of entry to an OT environment. However, when we look at vulnerabilities that are within the OT environment with the actual the hardware that's specialized there, your types of device that control pistons or pressure within a pipeline. It's a different game in terms of that patching policy and process to the enterprise IT side, where some of these devices may not able to be patched ever. They're too far in a remote location or underground, or it just is something that can never be taken offline for maintenance to enable that. Other times there's a more rigid maintenance cycle where you can patch. I would say as well the availability of patches and mitigations is often lower on the OT side, and that does leave customers with a question around what should they do and what should they do first. And certainly our vulnerability analysts here at Dragos, who are on part of the intelligence team, they often find that the severity that's applied to a vulnerability is usually the opposite way around to it should be. I think in at least 50% of the cases last year. So the high priority the mitigations or patches are being dealt with first, but really they're probably the hardest thing for an adversary to exploit, and we would regard those as being, low severity. And conversely, sometimes it's labeled as low, but actually this is exactly the thing that could give those actors the ability to remove the visibility or the control in that environment, and it's fairly trivial to make that happen. Tracking those threat actors, I did say that we focus solely on those who are operating within that OT space or have the ambition to operate within OT space. So we don't report on a group's attempts against, say, an embassy or targets of that nature. However, a lot of the same groups have multiple missions. And so we have a categorization into stage 1 and stage 2, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But essentially, if an adversary is no longer targeting any industrial organizations, or there is no strong focus on an industrial organization, then they can enter a phase where they are essentially deprioritized and later retired, because we want to look for the new threats out there. We want to concentrate on those threat actors that are still very focused on this particular area. And I think one other thing that really sets things apart, and not necessarily on the threat intelligence, but I think why it's so much more important to have that in that OT space. I've tracked many actors over the years for a variety of missions, and typically data theft is what the main goal is. That might go for financial gain. It might go against a country in some upcoming relations on a diplomatic sense. It might be theft of intellectual property to save money on R&D. But when we move into the OT space, we have not just a larger amount of scope for disruption in terms of affecting not just an organization, but potentially the customers of that organization, folks who depend on what that organization produces, be that energy, be that water. But also there's the scope for destructive attack. Now that might be, say, poisoning a water source. It might be affecting the safety levels in food production, or it could be physically destroying a device that affects those who work at that facility, or could affect those who live nearby, either directly or in terms of causing issues over many years in the surrounding geological area. So when it comes to the stakes, I feel are a lot higher in OT. Certainly why I moved to Dragos. And I think that that's why threat intelligence can't really be overlooked when it comes to OT. It's not simply about patching and good cyber hygiene. It's very much about knowing how that might be achieved within your environment and taking those additional steps to make sure that it just cannot happen. So I'll quickly run through a little example here. This is based on the incident in Ukraine in 2016, but really this is to kind of show some of the complex relationships that exist and why the threat intelligence that we produce can allow you to adequately mitigate, but also measure the risk, take those courses of action that might be more relevant to your organization. So Camasite is a group that we track that is really based around initial access. They do a lot to find devices, to find weak points in networks, and they will cover that off by gaining access to the network, propagating through, finding the documents that they may need to allow additional knowledge to be gained about that organization, and also really to maintain that link into that environment longer term. This might be all they do. They might have some other sort of options, I guess, at a later date. But in some cases, there is also a handoff to a secondary team. Now, Electrum are a team who would be classed as an effects team. They're not in every single Camasite intrusion, certainly not interested in every single victim that Camasite might be interested in. However, specific to OT, when it comes to industrial kind of espionage affecting that OT environment, Electrum are a disruptive actor. And so here in the Ukrainian example, disabling power at a power generation facility, they are definitely a stage 2 actor. They have that ability to operate within that environment and can use tooling that is specific to achieve their needs of a disruptive effect. So why Camasite might be relevant to your organization, even if perhaps Electrum wouldn't be, would be for a variety of reasons that I'll try and demonstrate here. So this is in the start of 2022. There was a large campaign known as Cyclops Blink, where we saw Camasite targeting a number of SOHO devices. So your small routers that you might have at home, provided by your ISP, or in your place of work if you're a small business. And that essentially allowed them to have a foothold globally. They could use that for anonymous communications. They could use that to potentially launch larger attacks, particularly scans. And that leads to probing those devices that you can see during the April timeframe. WatchGuard firewalls and routers. He just firewalls and routers. And this is just two particular ones in that particular campaign where they were very interested in seeing if there was, weaknesses that could be exploited there and potentially becoming part of that network as well. In May, a very different set of routers being targeted there, more likely to be to gain access to environments. But one thing I just wanted to bring up here is the targeting of IP cameras. Now, on the one hand, they could form part of that anonymous network too. They're a network device. You could use those to route your traffic. But they could also be used as a hopping point into another network. Perhaps they're dual homed. From there, you can launch some scanning against a Wi-Fi network that's a corporate network, begin to crack the access there and gain access to the network that way. But if we think about it in a larger context of why this activity was happening, where it was happening, what else was going on, at that point, Russia was in full swing with its intrusion in Ukraine. Those cameras could have been supporting those military operations. When you don't have very, I guess, very good kind of overhead visibility through satellites to have that imagery, perhaps IP cameras could be used to help you select targets for a ground attack, for a missile strike, and also confirm whether that was successful or not. So I think we often think about cyber attack and movement through the network, but particularly for an actor like Camasite, often associated with Sandworm, has been discussed by the US and their allies as being part of the GRU. a military actor is supporting military operations here using cyber means. It's a blended threat. And we can see that they progress to be able to gain access to that same network that they targeted in 2015. But at some point in the future, we still see Camosite, this time using a different set of malware, one that they'd actually got from open source, but conducting new operations to try and regain access to those same targets. If we move on to the next slide, we can kind of see that why this IT intrusion led to some OT effects, and perhaps why Camosite were then keen to gain access again. So during the April time frame, we see malware deployed to the Ukrainian utility provider, and on the right you can see the Purdue model there. You've got the IT network at the top, and you can see where Electrum were operating. So they had actually taken malware that they'd used previously, Crash Override, also known as Indestroyer. And this was a specific module that had been rewritten as a kind of one-time shot, Indestroyer 2 as it is known, and it only spoke IEC 104, 3 hard-coded IP addresses, specifically targeting the breakers within that environment to be able to control the flow of electricity. So this was a disruptive attack to be able to stop the electricity from flowing, remove electricity in the surrounding area. There are other things they could have potentially done. They'd certainly improved some of the timing issues that had existed in the IEC 104 module. They'd spent time understanding how the equipment worked and understanding the environment to know those exact 3 IP addresses that they needed. However, based on prior information about the previous attacks, could this be something that was stopped had the steps been taken to take that intelligence and put it into action? I'd say that alone, yes, it certainly could have. There were, very common overlaps within the tooling, the behavior of those communications on the wire, although, as I said, they'd fixed a timing issue, still something that you could signature for. It was made more difficult with the use of wipers that attacked not just the IT systems, but also those Windows and Linux boxes that are in that OT environment. So that would have hampered the defensive efforts of folks at this site. But I do think that, with the right kind of monitoring and the knowledge of those prior attacks, this is certainly something that could be avoided, or have other safeguards put in place that may have mitigated the fact that you had lost visibility due to a wiper, but actually something else deeper down would have stopped that malware from being as effective. And I'll just briefly talk about an actor we call Xenotime, probably one of the more well-known actors, given their incident in 2017 at a oil and gas customer within the Middle East. So Trisis was the malware. This targeted safety critical systems. It's worthwhile saying that this was the only time Dragos and some of our peers in industry who responded to incidents from this actor did actually see that interaction with the OT environment. However, given the nature of what they were trying to accomplish there, and luckily they weren't successful, it does show that they were interested in disabling those safety systems that could cause loss of human life. Now, why they're still important today and why the intelligence about this group is still important, maybe they're not involved in active attacks at the moment. We haven't seen that, and perhaps after they were called out by the US government and their allies as being attributed to a research institute in Russia, perhaps they're no longer allowed to conduct operations of that nature. But their reconnaissance and research continues. And this is very interesting from a perspective of knowing, the potential for future attacks, maybe not from this group, but maybe from a group they work with or on behalf of. And so understanding that they're very focused on oil and natural gas, liquefied natural gas, that they're moved to research and tools that are off the shelf and available, in the public domain, as opposed to necessarily using purely custom tooling. And the fact that it covers a number of industries that are all part of that downstream and midstream ONG and LNG industry. That's not just those who, operate the pipelines, but it's the maritime element, who operates the ships, who operates the ports, the actual components that might be used in some of the equipment, such as the LNG train. So that provides a number of different industry types, a number of different businesses, with the insights that there is still someone actively researching this who has been previously involved in cyber espionage and cyber attack of a destructive nature, and that's something you can then learn from their previous exploits and potentially defend against, but also think about what would happen if this actor did attack you today. Where might you need to bolster your defenses? And indeed, you should, because you know that there's at least one group out there who's interested in targeting your type of organization. Now, I've talked a lot about nation-state actors, but ransomware probably poses the largest threat to the industrial sector. Now, we don't see ransomware actors chiefly going after the OT environment. There have been cases where they have used an OT environment as their initial access point, and they have indeed modified the way they behave, knowing that they're in an environment which is very different to the enterprise IT world. But typically what we see is an enterprise IT network encrypted, ransom demanded, and some of those problems can be the fact that there is a flat network, or there isn't necessarily the security between those two environments that should exist, or sometimes is thought to exist, but doesn't and hasn't been checked, so that ransomware can spread to those Windows or Linux hosts within that environment. But chiefly, I think the problem is that when losing the ability to operate in the IT enterprise environment, a precautionary measure to shut down the OT environment is what a number of organizations do. And that comes down to a number of things. It comes down to your risk appetite, which, is informed by threat intelligence and understanding about previous incidents and potentially whether you can continue operating or not, should you. Another piece that we see often is that there is no OT-specific incident response plan. You know exactly what you need to do to get that IT enterprise back up and running. You don't know what you should do about the OT environment. You don't know necessarily if anything has spread into that OT environment due to lack of visibility. And so you have no choice but to essentially err on the side of caution and shut that down. And that can lead to obviously millions of dollars of loss as well. I think that on the enterprise IT side, a number of OT environments could continue to operate. However, they're often shut down. Now, there is a risk obviously there, and understanding that risk allows you to make those decisions. It's not always that going to be the correct decision, but that is the game of risk management. What poses a problem for me, I think, is that we look at the nation state actors. They are more surgical in terms of who they target, the number of targets, usually going to be one or a small handful of related organizations to achieve a goal. They don't tend to spread widely across the globe without kind of thought about the nature of that. That might be scanning, it might be for acquisition of infrastructure, but unlikely to try and gain access and destroy elements of every network they can find. But they also probably have the highest level of capability, so could achieve not just a destructive, but a destructive attack as well. Conversely, we see cyber criminals do things at scale. They try and get in as many places as they can. They are more likely to target you, but they're not as well trained and they don't have the same kind of level of technical competency. So although they might not be able to achieve a goal, and maybe that's not their motivation at all to cause that destructive effect, they don't necessarily know how they should operate if they find themselves in an OT environment. They don't know what changes they make to those systems, what effect that would have. Does that cause a safe shutdown? Does it cause an unsafe shutdown? Does it cause something to explode and reach a point where loss of life is a real possibility? And I think that the lack of discipline that we have, in the kind of criminal world, the motivations being financial, can drive people forward without those kind of thoughts. Whereas at least on the nation state side, things tend to be well-versed, researched practice before those attacks are ever launched. And I did cover briefly before, sorry, just about where we gain our threat intelligence from. But it's on the next slide, sorry. But I did just want to mention that it's that combination of those indicators, those TTPs, knowledge of those tools and how they work and how they can be detected, combined with the information we may have on attribution, and then how those campaigns fit into that wider geopolitical landscape that really is what you should expect from any operation, any threat intel provider, be that for IT or for OT.
100%. And I saw the salad kits that they weren't available. That's that's a challenge. So operationing the operationalization of OT threat intelligence. We have security automation, threat intelligence, and big data management. And before we do this, we need to look also at exposure management. So we need to understand what your footprint is in your environment. We also need to look at the raw data intelligence. So turning that raw data into intelligence. So as Magpie spoke, as far as intelligence is an important component of what's happening. And then finally, we need to amplify this to detect and respond in the environment, to understand quickly and how to react in the environment so we don't have a situation that occurs. This brings us to assessing, collecting, enriching, and integrating, detecting, investigating, responding, and collaborating together in the environment to understand this. So let's dig a little deeper. So number one, let's understand your attack surface. So in the Anomaly platform, we have actually an attack surface manager. We can take a look at your infrastructure and give you a grade. Everybody wants an A. In my example here, we have a B+. We're identifying end-of-life software, unreachable assets, exploitable CVEs, total internet-facing entities, expired certificates, your total CVEs, SSH services, and open ports in the environment. So these are all your exposures that you have to give access to, as Magpie mentioned, the adversaries out there in the environment. But let's go a little further. We also can ingest Dragos intelligence directly. So in our app store, we can actually bring in Dragos intelligence directly into the environment. So what does that look like? So by bringing the intelligence in, we identify, again, a created date, a modified date, expiration date, as well. We have over 300 I-types in the platform. So we'll tell you exactly what the actual intelligence type is. In my example here, it's a malware domain. We'll identify the indicator as well, the confidence given to that indicator, as well as severity. So you quickly have an understanding of the intelligence in a matter of seconds in the environment. So let's go one step further. So an example workflow, how are we affected? So we all get the briefings that come out. Did you hear, you get this briefing? It's a lengthy document, and the first question is, are we affected? So what do? So you skim the article and you identify key terms, indicators, and TTPs. From there, you research threat actors, malware families, vulnerabilities, etc. Extract and validate IOCs. You also search your logs to validate the presence for these over the course of weeks or months. And then finally, expand the search for others associated and repeat the whole process again. And this is a lengthy process that can take a while. Also, trigger response and remediation and cleanup. So you walk through this process. It's a lengthy process. It can take, in some cases, weeks or even months to apply in the environment. So let's do it the Anomaly way. So you hear about the new threat. Are we affected? The same question. So by utilizing our Lens offering, you can actually extract data from the article and associated indicators, actors, and TTPs in a matter of seconds. So it'll actually highlight the article of information, extracting the data out, and identifying exactly what the indicators are that are found on the page. So literally in a matter of seconds, we're scanning this article. This could be a lengthy document that could be 10, 20, or more pages long. Lens also correlates the logs. So therefore, looking back at your telemetry, we can go back several years. So therefore, in this example here, 510 matches. So we can identify the indicators of compromise on the actual page, this brand new document that says, hey, here's a bunch of information. How are we affected? You can send those to your security controls via our integrator. I'll talk about that later in the presentation, to trigger investigations also and responses in the environment. And we can do all this in seconds or a couple of minutes, depending on the document size in the environment. So let's take it a little deeper here. So anomaly match providing full visibility. We all have the log overload. So in most cases, you can look back around 90 days in your environment. As well, you have an intel overload. So intelligence keeps building, it's growing. But in a lot of cases, in your current environment, your current SIM technology, you're limited on the amount of intelligence that you can ingest in the environment, as well as your look back. The anomaly match platform can take it one step further. We can actually eliminate that 90-day look back, going back years in time, as well, taking all your intelligence, giving you full correlation at scale and velocity. So increasing your visibility across all historical logs, across all your actionable intelligence. So here's an example of anomaly match with correlations with Dragos information. So bringing the information in from Dragos directly into the anomaly platform and then correlating events in the environment. So as you can see in the screen here, I've got allowed actions against correlated events against a malware IP that was provided by Dragos. Very powerful. Also, we can look at your assets in your environment. So identifying not just what the asset is from an IP perspective, but exactly what the asset is. So identifying the host name, the department, where it lives. So you know exactly where the asset is and the challenge that you have to remediate in the environment. We also give you the ability to investigate, take it one step further. So bringing all this information into the anomaly platform, we can identify the threats as well. We can also identify, in this example here, the MITRE ATT&CK technique that was used in the environment. So now we're exposing directly what's happened based on the MITRE technique that's been used. As well, we can also dive a little deeper and investigate. This allows us to expand all the indicators of compromise. And from here, we can also enrich these with well-known tools. So think of tools such as Polyswarm or HIAS or VirusTotal, Gray Noise, etc. We can tap directly into these and enrich this data automatically in the environment. And then finally, in here in the platform, we've introduced Anomaly Copilot. So this is where we're taking full advantage of AI. So imagine asking your system a question, what is Lockbit 3.0? Explain these two, new malware variants to me in the environment. Ask the system in plain English questions to respond to you against the data that you have. That's Anomaly Copilot. This is a game changer in our environment. Taking Copilot one step further, let's apply this on our Lens technology. As we scan an article of interest and finding all of the IOCs, all of what we call entities in the environment, we can then summarize for an executive summary. If you've ever had a situation where you get these large documents and there's a lot of great information, but you need to understand what's in this document as well, you may have to deliver it to an executive team to give you the resources to do something with this. We can give you that ability today. So in the platform of Copilot within Lens, literally I can do an executive summary against an actual piece of information and identify the full executive summary. So summarizing all the data to give to your executives, or we can also do an analyst summary in the environment, but giving that data quickly for them to discern to give you the resources that you need. And then finally, remediation. So taking it to the next step. So once we've done these steps in the environment, we want to remediate. Anomaly Integrator allows you to bring in intelligence in the environment and then pass it down to your protection mechanisms. Drop it into a firewall, drop it into a web gateway, drop it into your DNS. So immediately push those indicators of compromise downstream into devices automatically to take the next action. So anomaly automation, taking IOCs from ThreatStream, using Anomaly Lens to automate your detection, as well with Copilot, correlating all your telemetry against all your intelligence in your environment, and then remediating with an immediate response in the environment. So alerts processed rapidly from analysts, from basically taking from minutes or hours to seconds in the environment. So a couple takeaways. OT threats are unique, as are the systems and vulnerabilities that impact OT. Dragos provides OT-specific threat intelligence but your threat intelligence will come from multiple sources. This is where ThreatStream can help you in your environment, or the Anomaly platform. You need to consolidate data from multiple sources, including OT and threat intel, and then find what matters to you in Anomaly. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Scott and Magpie. We do have some time for some questions today. So here's one for you, Magpie, where we can start out. Please elaborate, what is stage 1 and stage 2 of the ICS cyber kill chain? If you could elaborate on that, please.
Yeah. Under SANS, Mike Asante and our CEO, Rob Lee, published a paper that describes the ICS kill chain. So I'd refer to that for full details. But essentially, stage 1 actor has the focus to try and explore an enterprise IT environment to gain an understanding about maybe the processes that are happening within the OT environment, maybe the types of technology that are in there, to essentially open the door for future attacks, but doesn't have the capability to operate within that OT environment, or hasn't demonstrated that capability. Whereas a stage 2 actor, very much they have the capability and the know-how, how to move around in that OT environment, how to make a change within that OT environment, not necessarily, with a disruptive or destructive effect being observed, but that certainly would be considered an attack within the stage 2 kill chain if they did do that. So we have a variety of actors who are in stage 2, a larger number in stage 1, but I think that this is kind of a general trend that even if it's the same actor, or if it's 2 actors like Camasite and Electrum, where maybe another team is called in because they specialize, we're seeing that kind of increased pace in the research and in development as well of tooling that would enable easier operation within an OT environment. If I refer back to the pipe dream malware tools that we talked about in our white papers, you can see there that's kind of the ability to wrap some of the more common interfaces such as code assist or OPC UA into what's essentially a easier to use framework for a CNE operator. So initially, we're talking about the threat actor. We're talking about the kind of institution or a larger team. They have the expertise to operate within that environment, but the individual behind the keyboard might not necessarily have all that information. But that tooling is stage 2, and therefore the effects of it, are I guess, enable those maybe lesser focused operators to have the same effects and achieve their mission.
Thanks, Magpie. So here's the next question for you, Scott. Does Anomaly ThreatStream offer AI capabilities?
Yes, it does. So Anomaly ThreatStream offers AI capabilities through Copilot. So Copilot extends actually across the Anomaly platform. So Lens, Match, and ThreatStream are all included. Where you get a panel that you can ask the system plain English questions, and it will convert them in the environment and deliver results.
Great. Okay, here's another one from one of our attendees. Magpie, if you could maybe answer this, and do you have any statistics on the origin of the threats, attacks on OT coming from inside the org versus externally?
I don't to hand, although I'd say for statistics, you definitely want to check out our year in review that will be coming out very soon. Absolutely packed with stats on all things OT. I would say, based on chatting through with the folks who are actively engaged in both the incident response, but also some of the more proactive and penetration testing work, and then knowing the kind of cases that we've seen where an OT environment has been compromised. It's not typically inside a threat. And now that, is obviously something that's been in the news recently regarding the potential dissemination of Stuxnet back in the day. But I would say that, that is a potential way into a network, but not necessarily the easiest to facilitate. And I think given the additional connectivity that we see with an OT environment, whether that is to the cloud through various services, whether that's to the internet to allow engineers to access it remotely. I think that's just maybe the first and often sadly easiest way that actors can gain access, and so they don't need to go to the lengths that would be to coerce a member of staff. I guess the other side of that insider threat equation is someone who works there and operates in a malicious capacity. Typically, whereas you could cause some harm from a corporate perspective, maybe on the IT side, I don't think even a disgruntled employee would necessarily use cyber capability to enact something. That's more likely to be bypassing security mechanisms in a more traditional manner, which isn't something that we aren't necessarily going to look for. But I would say if there was anomalous activity within that network, it might still be something that the Dragos platform would pick up on for sure.
Thanks. Okay, this one's for you, Scott. What infrastructure is required to run Anomaly? What data sources can feed it environmental data?
So Anomaly can run both on-premise and in the cloud. So we have a SaaS offering and on-premise. We can feed from multiple sources in the environment. So we have a telemetry tool called Link that allows us to connect to sources to drive the telemetry in the platform. From an intelligence perspective, we draw from open sources as well as premium sources such as Dragos in the environment.
Okay, so here's one for Magpie. How do I identify my traffic, good and bad, and my devices? Is the system tapping into span report on my FW, or how is that working?
Yeah, so I guess going back to my previous comment about kind of understanding those unique protocols within the OT environment, that's the first step really to understanding where not just the potential threats, but obviously the devices themselves. A lot of OT environments have been around for a long time, 60s, 70s. They've kind of grown organically in some instances. Folks who maybe had an understanding of how that plant worked are no longer employed there, or sadly even no longer with us, and not necessarily the right documentation has been maintained. So I think the first step really is, once you can understand the traffic, you can then begin to pull apart the communications. You can work out that this is an HMI talking to a particular device, but also know that it's configured in a particular way, or that it's running a particular version of firmware. So all this then builds up that kind of asset inventory, gives you the visibility of what's actually in your network. At that point, you also are able to say, okay, that firmware version is vulnerable to these exploits or these vulnerabilities, and you're able to kind of highlight that to the user, as well as be able to look at those kind of underlying commands that might be anomalous in nature. The traditional kind of operation, particular packets or particular communications that go back and forth is in the standard configuration or the standard startup or shutdown of a device in that environment. Once you know that model and you look for things that don't comply with that, then you can raise that as being something anomalous, even if it's not necessarily known to be malicious. In terms of how it works, typical deployment of the Dragos platform would be passively through a span port. It can work across multiple sites. Often OT environments are maybe running over small links, so you can do a lot of the kind of detection and storage at a site, federate your queries there rather than bring it all back to a central location. That central location might be on-prem, it might be in the cloud. But in terms of those kind of integrations, so your firewall, for example, you can basically send something to a firewall, particular port or IP that the platform has decided is potentially risky and should be blocked. Obviously, the firewall then makes a decision whether that happens or not, but we integrate with a number of firewall providers. And we also have integration with some of the XDR products that are out there as well. So it's kind of that back and forth of detection to, I guess, unite your knowledge of what might be happening on a host or in the enterprise IT world with what's happening within that OT environment, and essentially shut that down in the fastest way possible.
Thanks, Magpie. Here's one for you, Scott. Is the Copilot ingest kept confidential for the organization using it?
It is. So Copilot runs internal to your instance of the Anomaly platform. It also is referencing your own data, so it does not reach out. So all data is kept confidential.
Thanks. There's actually a good follow-up question. How many clients are openly using Copilot, and is this an established process or just in early development?
It is in the final stages of beta. We're releasing it at the end of this month, actually. So for full production.
Here's one for you, Magpie. How do we identify the vulnerabilities which are reported as critical but are difficult for the attackers to access, and vice versa? The vulnerabilities which might seem low with regards to their criticality, but provide attackers with the visibility or control of some systems in our environment.
So whether it's a vulnerability for a specific device that operates within the OT environment, or it might be something that's commonplace in there, like a particular hardened firewall or the network appliance, we take those bulletins as well as conducting proactive research into vulnerabilities ourselves, and we assess them in a particular way. So we will score them. We don't. We do provide the CVSS for folks to use. It's a commonly understood way of measuring the various aspects of those vulnerabilities. But internally, we have a much richer way of being able to categorize them. I think one of the ways to kind of solve that problem of what should come first as well is we group them together in terms of now, next, and never. So we will say that now is those very critical vulnerabilities where there's potentially they're under active exploitation, or the impact is so great that that's something that needs to be patched or mitigated today. The next is typically things that can wait until the next maintenance cycle for that device, and the never are those that the chances of that being exploited require such a deep level of access to the network, or in fact that exploitation of that vulnerability doesn't provide any kind of additional control to the adversary or advantage to the adversary. It doesn't reduce the visibility, it doesn't reduce the control, and so it's probably something that you don't actually need to worry about. And that's how we categorize them in our reporting. And often as well, there's mitigations that may never appear in the original bulletin, but we might say, actually, this is something where in lieu of a patch, or if you can't patch, block this port, and that would actually mitigate the threat at this point. And sadly, that information just doesn't always appear in the vendor bulletins, but we do work with a number of vendors to essentially try and get them to push things out a little bit faster and a little bit more richer of information as well. So I think it's a maturing space really, as a lot of the security aspects of OT really are.
Magpie. All right, Scott, I think this one's for you. What database does Anomaly use to allow correlation of all of our logs and all our IOCs?
I wish I could tell you it's a secret. It's proprietary, so it's proprietary database that we built in our SaaS platform, and that gives us the speed and elasticity in the environment. So
I won't tell, Scott. I won't tell. Okay, so here's another one for you, Scott. How is Dragos licensed for current Anomaly, threat stream, and match customers?
So it's licensed through our App Store. So in the App Store, there is both a trial and also obviously a purchase. So it can be purchased through our App Store, and once it's licensed in the environment, it can be utilized both in the threat stream and the match offering.
Okay, I think that's probably all of the time for questions that we have today. Yeah. Okay, so I'd really like to thank Scott and Magpie for a really informative session, and thank you everyone for your questions today. If you don't have OT threat intelligence, if you're not aware of your top cyber threats, If you're not able to consolidate data to find what's relevant to your operations, please do reach out to Anomaly or Dragos, and we will help you. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone for your time today, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.